Beds People, taking a deep dive into the individuals who shape the University of Bedfordshire. On Radiolab 97.1 FM, in association with the University of Bedfordshire's Innovation and Enterprise Service.
Welcome to Beds People. Our guest today is a computer scientist with a string of publications ranging from deep learning for biometric face recognition to real-time price comparison algorithms to cybersecurity and digital forensics. In his spare time, he's also head of the Department of Computer Science and Technology at the University of Bedfordshire. Dr Paul Sant, welcome.
Thanks, Gordon. Welcome, everyone. Fantastic to speak to you all and looking to tell you a little bit about myself and hopefully then to be able to make lots of new connections with some of you.
So, Paul, since your PhD, your career has covered data science, computer security, algorithmics, artificial intelligence, electronic vehicles, all sorts of things. Your colleagues say that you're someone who works across many areas and you can apply yourself flexibly, but they also say that you're very focused. That does seem somewhat a contradiction in terms. You've simply said that you have a thirst for creating new ideas and applying them. So what made you first get into the field that you went into PhD-wise, and then what made you move on from there?
In terms of how I got into the field and the discipline, that's really down to my undergraduate studies and the people I met there, including Professor Martin Amos at Northumbria University and my PhD supervisor, Alan Gibbons. They just gave me an excitement for the area. They got me excited in terms of what you can do in computer science and how you can apply it, as well as looking at it from the mathematical perspective. So in terms of where I am now, it's really about the applied side of things. So how I can take my knowledge, look for real world problems in industry and really apply that knowledge to help drive businesses forward.
Martin Amos was your PhD supervisor, presumably?
No, he's my second supervisor in my PhD. He was actually the supervisor of my undergraduate project, which was inspired by biology and looked at how you could potentially use biological materials to provide parallel machines for solving quite difficult and challenging problems in computing. And he got my thirst for knowledge in terms of looking at how you can sometimes apply different approaches from different disciplines to problems in computing or business or, in fact, any problem pretty much that you can model within a biological system.
So you see what mathematics and computing are a tool for solving other discipline problems, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Music has its foundations in mathematics. You read the book Mathematics of Prime Numbers, a fantastic read, and talks to you about how a musical score, actually you can look at that from a mathematical perspective, but perhaps more about that later on.
So back in PhD days, where were you living at the time? What was life like?
So I started off my PhD living at home with my parents and then moved down to the Big Smoke, down to London to work at King's College. What were things like? Fantastic. So I grew up in a rural part of northwest England. So the Big Smoke and London was all flashing lights and completely new and initially alien to me. But actually that's where I live now and I couldn't think of living anywhere else. It's so eclectic and it gives you an opportunity to work with so many of the world's best experts who are in and around the southeast of London.
Data science and algorithmics, was that a growth field at the time? Was it an area that everybody was interested in, or was it something of a niche? What was going on in the field then?
Well, algorithmics is a fairly niche field, so it's looking at how you can develop and solve problems. Of course, the applications of that are much more wide-ranging, but in the UK it was a fairly small field. Data science, as we know it today, didn't exist, but of course for many years we've been looking at ways in which we can find patterns in data. We can look for patterns in data, and that goes all the way back to the 1970s with the kind of first forays into artificial intelligence in terms of game playing, in terms of chess. But what we're seeing now is those areas broadening out and being much more mainstream than they were in the past.
So, Paul, you told us what the field was like 20 years ago, 30 years ago. What's happened since then? What has happened in your field in that time, and how have you kept up with the changes?
Well, there have been massive advances in terms of where it's been applied. So now people have realised that data is the new oil. So there's been a massive growth in the number of people working in development of solutions for finding patterns within data sets. We've seen a massive growth in the internet. So back when I was studying in the mid-90s, the internet was only really taking off. And if we think now how dependent we are on the internet, it was pretty inconceivable 20, 25 years ago. But actually look at where we are now. We use the internet almost every day. We're creating more wealth every day than we have since the beginning of time, and we're doubling that all the time. So there's a mass of data, but that data is only beneficial if you can transform it, if you can find out interesting facts and information about it, and then feed that back into the system. Artificial intelligence has continued to grow, so it's no longer the realm of people trying to develop artificial intelligence chess games and people working on IBM's Deep Blue and various other computer systems. It's now the mainstream. So artificial intelligence, be that Amazon Alexa, be that a range of different devices like Siri on your mobile phone, it's become mainstream. That's one of the main differences. And now we're seeing organizations, both large and small, utilizing that for their own business benefits.
So looking at the national industrial strategy, there's a strand of that which is completely linked to sort of 4 national pillars, I think. So is that why you've branched out from algorithms originally, or algorithmics originally, mathematics originally, or is that just your natural personality? You just want to try everything and explore everything?
I certainly want to explore everything, and what I've realized is actually there are many tools in artificial intelligence that are particularly good for applying to pattern matching, applying to finding out information and finding out trends. So rather than create and reinvent the wheel, it's about looking at how we can apply and expand the existing approaches. So that's really inspired me to look into new areas, but also the PhD students that I've worked with. So, for example, Mark Hooper, who looked at applications of artificial intelligence in a field called recommender systems, which for the layperson out there, things like Amazon, and when you go on to look for Amazon, when you go to buy a particular product, it often pops up with a message, people who bought this may also like, albeit were interested in these 5 additional items. So those recommender systems we looked at, and Mark built a new approach to recommender systems that, rather than it being purely algorithm-based and rule-based, looked at how you can bring in people's perception, people's emotion into the buying strategy, and built a prototype that could capture that information and make recommendations that weren't just on people's purchase history, but actually took into account their environment. So were they in a busy environment like the shopping centre? Was there noise around them? Were they sitting in the comfort of their living room? Were they feeling particularly inspired at the time? And you utilise that to build a model that could be much more accurate.
It's interesting, the people side. So data and AI isn't just about building clever whiz-bang software systems, it's about people as well.
Yeah, I mean, the true definition of intelligence and the true mantle of artificial intelligence is to build a machine that is exactly like a person and can think like a person. So there are many factors that go into making decisions about what we do on a day-to-day basis, be that shopping on Amazon, be that making a decision about whether we go on the train this morning, in the morning, or whether we take the car, and really trying to move artificial intelligence into that area where it is less robotic, less machine-like, and much more like interacting with humans.
Beds People on Radiolab 97.1 FM in association with the University of Bedfordshire's Innovation and Enterprise Service.
There are obviously big international development goals, OECD development goals. There are problems with poverty, there are problems with food production, that sort of. So have you worked on anything, or are there big drivers in this field that are looking at those problems, do you think?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of work within AI and law, for example. So applying artificial intelligence to decision making within the law environment. And I have a couple of colleagues, Professor Katie Axon up at the University of Liverpool and Professor Peter McBurney at King's College in London, amongst others, who've been working in and around those areas. We also see applications around agent-based software technology, so agents being able to perform transactions without the involvement of any humans. So they've been trialled out on stock markets and have their bases in a field of mathematics called game theory. They're the real kind of drivers, the socio-economic economic ones, but also we're seeing artificial intelligence making new developments in the areas of, for example, driverless cars. So people are looking to benefit. People are looking for example in long journeys. Can the car take over in autopilot? And autopilot is nothing necessarily new. It's been in effect in the airline industry for many, many years, but actually this is bringing it to the consumer market and to the everyday lives of people so that they can actually see that in action. And actually one of the most exciting stories I've seen recently was back in January, February, when we had the two big storms, Storm Ciara and Storm Dennis, where there was a BBC News article showing that Tesla's artificial intelligence had applied the brakes automatically in a family's car as a tree was coming down the middle of the road and undoubtedly stopped them from losing their lives, so actually saved their lives. So real world examples out there that touch the lives of real world people.
You've had lots of projects over the years. I want to ask you about some of your current and recent projects in a moment. But as well as that, you're also running an entire department, quite a busy department from what I know, covering all sorts of things. How do you find the time? What is it about you? Do you just thrive on challenges?
Yes, certainly thrive on challenges, but also thrive on building a good team around me. So it's not just about me. I have a fantastic team of staff who deliver to students, who supervise students, who come and help me when I need to work on things. So it's about delegating, but also providing a supportive environment to develop people, to give them career opportunities, and essentially to work together as a team. There is no I in team. So whilst I head up a department, it is the department that helps me achieve all the goals that we set out to achieve. I might have some ideas, but I always need a good team behind me in order to make those ideas come to fruition and to reality.
So is that the advice you would give to the younger version of you if you were to bump into yourself 20, 30 years ago? Is that the advice you'd pass on?
Absolutely. Teamwork is essential, been essential for some time, but we're now realising more than ever that teams and sharing the load is actually going to produce a much better result than if we all try to do work in silos and do things alone.
I certainly can't argue with that. What do you do when you're not working?
Run around London, run across the country, do a lot of exercise. In my younger days, I used to play a lot of six-side football. I also play golf, and of course, everything that keeps me going, my wife and my daughter, so I spend a lot of time with them. But yeah, certainly running, great stress relief, great opportunity to keep fit, and actually a great way of meeting a lot of people as well.
Okay, Paul. I want to get to some of the projects you're working on now, some of the projects you want to work on in the future. What projects are you working on at the moment?
So I have a couple of projects. One that's finished recently, which was a knowledge transfer project, or a KTP, where we work with Drax technology, a small to medium enterprise in Hertfordshire, and looked at applying artificial intelligence and machine learning to develop a smart solution to generate intelligent alarms and how you could utilize the data coming for those alarms as a feedback cycle in order to reduce the number of false positives, to keep people safe, and actually to generate really fantastic dashboards that management can use both within Drax but also within their clients. And that was undertaken by one of our graduates who became the KTP associate, Usman Ali, and he did a fantastic job. And he's just about to submit a MSc by research to reflect all of the developments that he did during that project. And more recently, I've undertaken a project with Mohammed Ahmed, who is a PhD student from one of our partners, Middle East University in Jordan. And we're looking to develop electronic health records that utilize blockchain technology in order to keep that information secure, and also to make sure we have a non-reputable chain so that data can't be changed. Nobody can ever argue that the data in there is not legitimate. So two of the projects that have kept me thriving over the last 2 years or so, and certainly over the next 2 years, Mohammed's PhD work is really going to develop new things specifically for applications of electronic health records in Jordan in the Middle East.
I spoke to Drax before we came on. Certainly they say the impact of that project has been quite significant for their company. They've had to employ 4 new staff to keep up with sales. The alarms are things like fire alarms and water system alarms and that going on in buildings all over the world. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. And you can be talking about massive estates like hospitals, which may be over many kilometres in terms of their footprint. So being able to react quickly and identify things like how many times a fire door is left open, and therefore potentially put in training in place for employees to make sure that they're not propping open fire doors and thus making an additional risk.
And electronic health records, of course, right now there's going to be, I think, a significant drive towards more and more things happening electronically, given the situations of everybody's working from home and that sort of stuff. So your work is involved in the security of those, is that right?
Yeah, so it's about setting up a system where different health providers can share information. So a patient can share their electronic health record with a number of different providers, and they can take it with them, so to speak. So if they move state, if they move government, if they move country, there is still an opportunity for the new health practitioner to be able to see the historical health record of somebody, so that they can then prescribe the most appropriate form of therapy or most appropriate procedure that may be needed for that particular individual, but ensuring that the individual retains the ownership of those electronic health records and only shares and only updates, and they are the owner. Other people can have views to read, but not necessarily update unless they are the assigned health practitioner for that particular individual.
Well, that's interesting. The concept that data has a value. So is this part of a wider move to give people more control, more ownership of their data?
Yeah, I mean, we see things like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. We see more and more private data, and we've seen some rather high-profile cases where large organisations have been subject to security attacks, either state-sponsored, advanced persistent threats, or like the WannaCry example against mainly the health services across the world, where people's data and information was encrypted. And so there's an ever-increasing need in order to protect that. However, quite often a piece of data that's in cyberspace doesn't seem particularly, in terms of monetary value, valuable to anybody until it comes to a point at which their data is no longer under their control.
Beds People, taking a deep dive into the individuals who shape the University of Bedfordshire on Radiolab 97.1 FM in association with the University of Bedfordshire's Innovation and Enterprise Service.
Coincidentally, as we've been talking, Paul, I've had a contact come in from Luton Borough Council and from SEMLEP asking if you'd like to work with them on work with a particular company that's looking for inward investment into the UK. So they're looking to relocate into the UK with a focus on digital health. So that sounds like it might be an opportunity that's come from this. Very nice. But where else do you want to take your career? What else do you want to work on?
I really want to work on developing new knowledge, on developing new techniques, on giving an opportunity to bright-minded individuals to come and work and to share in that and to develop new ideas, and ultimately to make an impact, either at a business level or in terms of research grants and real world applications and real world impact to those in society.
I mean, making an impact, there's so many things that you've done that I know of. Smart cities, I believe you're doing something about bus on demand as one of them. What was that about?
Okay, so we've done some work in and around smart cities in relation to smart grids and smart electricity. We've also looked at smart transport And one of the areas that we were looking at was the ability to develop mobile applications that could be utilised by somebody wanting to use the local bus service to identify whether the buses were currently full, and utilising things like counting devices or CCTV cameras, so that we could then potentially give alternative routes if a particular bus was busy, then give guidance to that individual so that they could then go to a nearby bus stop without having to wait for 3, 4, 5 different buses that were all full to come up until they got a space on the original route. So that was that. And in terms of smart grids, worked with Ashraf Mahmood, another of my PhD students, around real-time energy-led demand, slightly different versions of smart meters that could be bidirectional. So whilst we may get messages pushed to us from the electricity boards, actually being able to feed our own information back, and again to use that in terms of feedback to reduce the stresses and strains of electricity supply around peak times. So trying to smooth the peak out across the day rather than it being 7 o'clock in the morning where everyone gets in the electric shower, puts the kettle on, puts the toaster on, and there's a huge spike in demand. Because whilst there are lots of interesting research around being able to store energy, at the moment there is no cost-effective way of storing energy. So any energy that's generated that isn't used is potentially lost, and so that's a waste. So trying to be able to be more efficient and more effective and a bit smarter about how we can do that.
You're impacting companies economically, you're creating growth, you're creating jobs, you're reducing carbon. Seems to me like you're doing healthy aging stuff. There's a whole lot of different areas of impact you're having. All of this comes back from original work on graphs and graph theory. And I mentioned graphs and graph theory for a couple of reasons. Obviously, at the moment with the COVID-19 outbreak, there's lots and lots of people looking at lots and lots of graphs online, and they're fairly simplistic, I assume. Would you say everything that you've worked on has something to do with graphs and graph theory then?
Certainly you can build it in that way. So there's always a link, and the graphs that I typically work with slightly different than the histograms that you might see on an Excel spreadsheet. So I talk about nodes, which could be electricity stations, they could be people, they could be vehicles, and I talk about connections between them. So I use a mathematical model of graphs that allows me to determine relationships. So a lot of the projects that we work with can have as an underlying model a graph sitting with them. So for example, a lot of the work that we've done in computer security use graphs to model, for example, attacks. So the top of the graph, which we call our root, is the goal that the attacker wants to achieve. And then we have a series of what we call leaves at the bottom of our graph, which represent the ways in which the goal can be achieved. And then we look at the relationships and ways in which we can combine those together to get the goal being achieved as quickly as possible. So that's one application of graphs, but also work that goes on around, for example, the internet, and determining clusters and information about how the internet develops. And there's a lot of work that's been done in and around social network analysis of the World Wide Web as we know it, how communities form and how information becomes shared, and how potentially that could be exploited by individuals. So for example, how well connected you are, so how many people connect to you versus how many people do you connect to. If we used a very simple measure of how many connections are there emanating from you, then that would give us one measure. But actually, if all you're doing is connecting to others, then you're potentially trying to exploit their connections and their networks for your own gain, rather than necessarily being a truly fair individual in the development of the World Wide Web, for example.
It's a whole different way of thinking about what we do on Facebook and what people do on Facebook and how things work. Lots of stuff about bidirection. Where does your career go, Paul? Do you stay as researcher? Do you stay as head of department? Do you stay as both? What is there a particular group of other people you want to work with? How do you see yourself 20 years from now?
So what I really want to do is to develop more and more research that is having an impact. So looking at the development of that side of my career, looking at, hopefully, in the future, being able to secure a professorial position, and really to essentially have a goal of sharing that knowledge, helping others, and hopefully that will allow them to develop their own research careers and to benefit from some of the nuggets of wisdom that I have.
Paul, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, hearing about your work. It really has. I have one last question for you, other than tell us a joke, which is something I ask everybody. Do you have a joke by any chance?
I have to think about that one and come back to you, I think.
Okay, then my last question is fairly simple. Who else do you think we should interview?
There's lots of people that I think you should interview, but probably one of the ones that I've worked very closely with most recently is Ingo Fromholz, who works in the fantastic area of information retrieval. And that's important because actually, as I was saying before, data is the new oil, and actually there's so much of it, and it's like finding a needle in a haystack. So some of his research around quantum information retrieval will give your listeners a fantastic insight into the world of quantum mechanics and how it's having an impact in computer science.
I think Ingo's going on the list. Paul, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure hearing from you.
You're welcome.
BEDS People, taking a deep dive into the individuals who shape the University of Bedfordshire on Radiolab 97.1 FM in association with the University of Bedfordshire's Innovation and Enterprise Service.